I'm a big fan of JRPGs. I love the Xeno series, I love the Final Fantasy series, and I love Friendship. The wide array of command-based combat styles with unique mechanics and stories of cosmic and biblical scale, quite literally sometimes, are all tons of fun to experience with the party of characters the game has. When it comes to horror games though, I don't love them. It's not the game's fault though, it's kind of my fault. It's because I'm a little weenie baby boy when it comes to spooks. I've gotten a lot better recently though. I beat Silent Hill 2 while only testing the absorbency of my Hanes drawers twice. I did get chalk on the controller though, just so it didn't slip out of my hands. But usually when someone says JRPGs, you think of large fantastical worlds with different kingdoms, or someone yelling about friendship a little more frequently than an alpha American male that thinks their lone wolf is comfortable with. How about we take JRPGs, and we take horror, and we make a game out of it. And that's the basis of the series I'll be reviewing today. Parasite Eve is a horror series developed by Square, and once it became Square Enix, that is based on a book by the same name written by Hideaki Sena, and the game serves as a sequel to the book. I didn't read the book. What do I look like? Do I look like a loser? This is going to be a review of the entire Parasite Eve series. There are 3 games in total, and I'm going to review each of those individually, and then I'm going to review all of them as a collective whole at the end. So let's quit dwaddling. I'll start this one off with a couple of fun facts. Fact number 1. Did you know that this is Squaresoft's first M-rated video game? Whoa, that's wild. Fact number 2. I played this game when I had COVID-19. Whoa, that's nuts. The first entry into the series was released in 1998 for the PlayStation 1, and it mixes real-time combat with cooldowns and horror elements to create a JRPG. Okay, it's hardly a JRPG, but I'm gonna call it one anyway. A JRPG experience unlike any other. It's a good and interesting game, but I do have some nitpicks. None of them are major enough to ever consider it a bad game, so this acts as a warning for the tone I'll take with the review. I'm gonna sit here and probably nitpick a whole bunch of things about it to the point where you might sit there and be like,
he doesn't particularly like the game, I don't think.
I like the game. Don't get me wrong, I like the game. I just feel like it had a ton of potential and it missed a couple marks. But let's just get into the specifics. Let's give some quick context to the game. So you play as NYPD cop Aya Brea, and the game opens with her going on a date to the opera. And while watching the opera, you could say some events happen. You could say her date really combusted in his pants. Pretty much everybody did. From there, the game takes place in New York City. That's enough to qualify it as a horror game on its own, as Aya tries to solve the mystery of sort of what's going on, because there's these mutated creatures and this weird mutated lady, and everybody keeps catching on fire. I think making the game M was a prerequisite to make sure that the people playing this game were old enough to have taken a biology class, because this game is very sci-fi focused and a lot of the science fiction is based on biology. It's a really neat story, and even though at times it's predictable, the scope and ideas it presents are engaging and unique. The character drama mixed in between with it, the cast of cops and a scientist, also makes the game more interesting than just a let's save the world from this bad thing. Even so, I was never personally attached emotionally to the story, and occasionally had off pacing with some really weirdly placed pre-rendered CGI cutscenes that contributed to that. They had a good handful of pre-rendered cutscenes, but sometimes they felt a little off and random. They kind of felt like, we've done the work for these, might as well put them in. That's all I'll say about the story though. I like it. I probably would have liked it a lot more if I was in middle school, but I still think it's a really cool story with really neat ideas. So before playing this game, I heard it was a horror game, and as somebody who is prone to getting soggy drawers because of spooks, I was a little nervous. The intro started out with some very strong horror vibes, and it was a superb intro. From there, the horror elements kind of, for me personally, they kind of started to fall apart a little. The way I'd like to describe it is a dark atmosphere, but not a horror atmosphere. Once I adapted to the general atmosphere of the game, I no longer became spooked, and there's a whole bunch of reasons contributing to this. I'll talk about the pros of the atmosphere first, which would definitely be the visuals. The creature design is gross, bloody, and cool. There are plenty of disgusting animations and images throughout the game that evoke the general horror mood. The enemies are essentially animals that have been mutated, so their bodies are ripping apart, their bones are sticking out, their skin is torn and showing their muscles underneath, and they've just grown into these unknown creatures. And the world is very dark, it's broken, it's messy, things are destroyed. That and the story premise are essentially where the horror elements ended for me. And what begins to break the horror atmosphere is mainly the gameplay, and you can separate the gameplay into two different sections, which would be combat and navigation/exploration. The level design is where I have some of my strongest gripes with the game. So as I said, the horror of the game, even though it's a survival horror game, relies heavily on the visuals. And the horror of the visuals, just being a dark atmosphere with some goop, really wasn't enough to sell the horror, nor was it enough to communicate properly. Like many PS1 games, the backgrounds are pre-rendered, and because the game is so dark, it was often difficult to see where to go. The signaling of important information was inconsistent. You know how in level design, to indicate places you can go, it's often indicated by the camera angle, or a light, or something of the source leading you in that direction? This information wasn't shown all the time, so sometimes you had to go into areas that didn't seem like they'd be traversable based on the logic other parts of the level would use. This inconsistency also showed up when it came to picking up items. Some items would have a small sparkle to them to indicate like, hey bucko, get your filthy mammal mitts on me. Not every object had these indicators though, and it felt like items weren't treated with the same design rules as other levels, creating an inconsistent language within the game. These inconsistencies overall distracted from the horror and made it difficult to get immersed when I was just annoyed. There was one area that was like a maze, and I just couldn't remember where to go. I may or may not have typed the words Parasite Eve 1 walkthrough on Google. I might have clicked a link, and I might have scrolled to the appropriate section on some sort of related writing. I might not have done that. Don't accuse me of things you don't know. How else is the horror impacted by the gameplay? Mainly because there were no threats within the world to the character. Why, you ask? Because it's turn-based, you silly goose. There are no creatures roaming the halls that can pop out of random areas, and it made the levels feel empty and not very threatening. The way you fight enemies is you enter some sort of invisible zone, and within that zone a creature, or however many you have to tussle, they show up. And then the battle takes place within that location in the level, but you're sort of boxed in to an invisible area. So usually in JRPGs, when you activate a random encounter, like for Final Fantasy, you're transported to some sort of different realm to fight the enemy. And in this game, you stay within the level, but Aya has to run to her own special spot on the map, and the transition is so obvious that it ruins the horror of it. The transition is essentially a little like of like a heartbeat. The screen flashes a color for a second, all the enemies sort of fade onto the screen. There becomes a clear separation between the navigation of the game and the danger and the battle. And so once I began to pick up on how the areas were designed within levels, I could usually predict when one was coming up. Getting into battles was never really a surprise, and thus there was no stress of any threat that's essential to the horror, specifically the survival horror genre. It was just sort of like, boop boop boop. Yeah, it's battle time. The sound design also took away from the general atmosphere as well. All that there really was in the sound department was your footsteps, and since there are no creatures roaming the halls, there really aren't many other sounds to build up the tense atmosphere. Usually in survival horror, like Silent Hill for example, you can hear the other creatures in the level, but you just don't know where they are, and that builds up a very tense atmosphere, and that is completely lacking in this game. The soundtrack honestly doesn't help either. Before I trash the soundtrack, I must say it's a really good soundtrack. It has some absolute bops on it, and some songs that do evoke some sort of like spooky vibe to it. But listen to this song slaps. But within the realm of navigating levels and fighting enemies, the songs would often be a little bit too hyped to get me really feeling tension or suspense. They were really good songs, but they didn't entirely fit the horror mood. You know, it's hard to build tension when you're jamming. I want to talk about the goods of the game though, because there are many legitimate goods, I swear. Is this what a bully feels like once they've come to the realization that they're garbage? I feel like I was a bit mean on the game. The combat is a lot of fun. That feels better. The gameplay is a combination of ATB style turn-based paired with real-time combat. ATB stands for Active Time Battle System, and it's sort of like you have a bar that charges up, and once it fully charges, you can use a command. And so once Aya has her turn charged, she can activate a sphere, and this sphere indicates the range of the weapon she is using, and she can attack any enemy that is within the range of that sphere. Each weapon she has a certain number of shots that fire per turn as well, so upon target selection, Aya shoots that number of shots, and then it's back to running around. She does have a few powers she can use, but it mostly comes down to shooting. While you're waiting for your turn to charge, you're dodging enemies that leap at you, and projectiles they shoot, and then once it's your turn, you have to wait till you're in a good spot to get the most output you can without getting hit. It's a lot of fun and has a fairly good bit of strategy to it. More shots per turn means more damage, but also more shots means more time for the enemy to hit you. Then there's the weapon's range to factor in as well. There's a lot of balancing you have to do when it comes to figuring out which weapons you want to use while keeping nimble to not get hit by any of the attacks. The closer you get to an enemy too, the likelihood of a critical hit being delivered increases, which adds another layer of risk and reward. To keep in line with its horror ideas though, when Aya is running around, she's no, Mario doing insane movement and dodging. She is just a human, so all she can do is, scurry around, no advanced movement, so she's a little bit slow, so you have to be very deliberate with what you do because it's much closer and grounded to reality, so your positioning and dodging needs to take all that into account. That being said, that does come with a flaw as well. Some of the enemy's movements aren't super readable, and since Aya is pitter-pattering around as she runs, it can be more difficult to dodge these attacks cause she is a bit slow. There eventually was a power you could unlock called Haste, which increased her turn charge speed as well as her movement speed, and it became a super useful and very fun ability to use, but it was disappointing because it didn't last very long at all. The enemies and their attacks also frequently lacked variety, which was slightly disappointing. The beginning showed signs of some real nifty bullet heck-like elements within the dodging, but it didn't progress to the levels I was hoping it would. Also, the final boss can eat my shorts. The lack of weapon variety was also slightly disappointing. Most of them felt generally the same, aside from their range, clip size, and shots per turn. There was a neat system where you could tune your weapons to change different stats, but the game's survival horror elements of limited inventory space had moments of ruin in this as well. I really wasn't sure what were the best weapons and what were the best things to change about guns, and since I had limited space, I couldn't wait for a better gun or experiment, so it ended up in me wasting a bunch of stat buffing items. The entire combat system though, while with a set of flaws, I felt was very strong, and I would love to see the idea improved. The mixture of real-time and turn-based elements within an arena were super engaging and tons of fun. I would absolutely love to see these ideas expanded upon with more and unique weapon choice and customization, more enemy variation, and more interesting movement. Good thing there's a sequel. Well, dang, there go those combat mechanics. I expected to be let down by this entry. Before getting into the series, I had heard some mixed things about the games past the first one, so I went in with full knowledge that some balls might be dropped along the way. I'm pleased to announce that I actually enjoyed the game much better than some people sold it to me. I used the word JRPG a lot when discussing the first game. Even though it was heavily survival horror, I still called it a JRPG. As of Parasite Eve 2, I'm now not going to call it a JRPG anymore. It has abandoned that and gone full survival horror, for good and bad. I can see why many people got upset about this game though. I personally think this entry works better as a horror game than the first. I mean, it's also just Resident Evil, but it's like, imagine it's 1999 and you've only played Resident Evil 1. You go to your bud's house down the street after school because you're a kid with no responsibilities, and your mom took your skateboard for a week because she heard the F word in a punk song you started listening to because of Tony Hawk Pro Skater. So you show up at your friend's house and he's tapping buttons on a little CRT in his room, and you go, "Hey, what are you playing?" He jests,
Resident Evil 2.
with a sly smirk. With only your knowledge of the first Resident Evil, you could watch him play this game and go, "Yeah, that's Resident Evil 2. But it's not Resident Evil 2. Stuart, I'm cool because I have holes in my jeans. Johnson lied to you like the soggy rat he is. It's Parasite Eve 2. As much as this sounds like a bad thing, constantly saying it's just a Resident Evil thing, I actually thought it was pretty good. I don't like being the type of guy who makes stark title comparisons, especially without any nuance. So in gaming journalist fashion, I'll call it Resident Evil with powers and very light RPG elements. I really do think they did it well, and personally did things better in this one than the first. Let's talk about something that was worse than the first though. The narrative. Parasite Eve 2 was released in 1999, again for the PlayStation 1. The game takes place a handful of years after the first, and you're still Aya. Instead of being a cop though, you're part of a new branch of the government called Mist, with the purpose of wiping out all the nasty monsters left over from the incident in the first game. Aya gets called into a situation, and it ends up being well more than a simple cleanup. From there, rather than being a massive situation like the first, it becomes much more of a mystery that Aya has to solve. There are of course large stakes, but it's not on the same scale as the first. From there, the story is inferior to the original game. The story feels more like Resident Evil, again, unfortunately I have to say that again, than Parasite Eve. No spoilers or anything, but bad man labs in a secret place with bad guys. It's a little typical, and it's not as drenched in the unique lore of the Parasite Eve universe as the first. None of the characters from the first game are in it either, save for Aya, and the characters that are in it, I really don't care about. They never really got much screen time to build something to care about, except for Douglas and Flint. They're cool. The story does get its interesting moments and elements, as well as some interesting lore from reading, interactable little journals and stuff like that, and that's where the story really shined for me. But now, we're on to the good parts, which is the gameplay and level design. As I said, the game is much more of a survival horror, and its design suits that better. One of the major elements being that the enemies are actually on the map rather than being random encounters. This helps build the tension of levels because that means, due to the fixed camera angle style the game takes, sometimes you can hear enemies but you can't see them, which can be slightly stressful at times and thus improves the game as a horror experience. This game also takes heavy advantage of limited inventory space, making each slot of space you have valuable. So when you start running low on space, you have to take some risks, you have to make some sacrifices, and you have to make decisions. The level design also supports the horror elements better by being, I can't believe I'm going to say this again, much more similar to Resident Evil than the first game. In the first game, you would go to new locations more frequently and leave the location for good. This game took place mainly in 3 locations, well, really like 4, kind of 5, one of them's a day and night, but one of the locations is only for the short intro. The other 2 locations have tons of paths leading in and out of areas that you slowly unlock as you progress. I had a really good time with the level design. They felt like Zelda dungeons rather than being levels you simply go through. The second location, Dryfield, which is the one that has a both day and night version, was my favorite. The town had all sorts of little paths in between places as you ran all around town trying to find information. It really wasn't a large town either, but its complexity and density made it feel like a town was a town transformed into a game map rather than being a town designed as a game map. The save spots were also well placed to where you could easily access one without it being too long of a jog if you knew where to go. And they're typically well placed before big fights, so if you lose, you don't have a bunch of dumb stuff to redo. I just had a lot of fun running around the levels, being dense rather than long and annoying. The game did have some puzzles in it, and hot sauce, there were some dumb puzzles occasionally, just very complex, requiring certain items or having to spam the interact button to hopefully find the thing you need to interact with within the dark pre-rendered background to complete the puzzle. That's the main element to the level design I didn't like. There was a lot of hidden stuff in the backgrounds that wasn't obvious it was interactable, so it got to the point where the moment I was stuck, I started to interact with the internet. It was just at the point where I didn't really want to scramble all around the map trying to find that one particle hidden in a dark corner. The music once again though is really good, and this time it suits the horror, survival horror atmosphere much better than the first, and it raises the overall tension. The combat system, while switching it up and having its own positives, I think comes as a sad loss. Since the enemies are on the map, it takes the Resident Evil style narrow corridors as you slowly fire at the enemies and dodge them around rooms with fixed camera angles. It's still good and lots of fun, but I really did want to see where they would take the combat system of the first, and I think it's a big lost opportunity. I'm sitting here thinking, man, I wish they scrubbed up that system for this one. At the same time, I can also still sit here and say, at least it's good. The combat system comprises of different weapons with different fire rates, damage amounts, shots per clip, mobility, and some potential upgradability to each. It's disappointing how few of the weapons actually have decent upgradability, some being weapons with hardly any, while the assault rifle has much more extensive upgradability with different attachments and other stuff like that. There are also different types of ammo, but each ammo type does pretty much just more damage damage, and the more damage it does, the more rare that ammo type is. And all these options create room for choosing which weapons you like and performing with those. Do you like the highly mobile burst weapon? Or do you like the automatic where you can sit back and unload but you run slower? These options become limited though as you play and realize some of the weapons just aren't very good or worth using. Each weapon has its ammo and takes up space in your inventory, so being a survival horror, you have to be picky about what you bring. The game does use the word experience points when it comes to the magic and leveling system, but I feel like that was a lie. EXP points were more like a currency than anything because you pay for the powers with XP. So my little dumb boy brain thought that you either had to choose your character being a higher level or powering up your abilities. And being a dumb little boy, I didn't buy any powers for a bit hoping to level up, which never happened. The only real leveling happens through upgrading your weapons, abilities, and armor, not a traditional JRPG leveling system with health increase and friendship stats improving. This is the main aspect to it, to why I say it has light RPG elements, but of course doesn't fully classify as a JRPG. Overall, it is a good game. Just don't expect the experience you get from the first game when you load this one up. It felt so icky to sit there and compare it to Resident Evil. That's not good writing. Shame on me for doing that so much. So I swear for the third one, I won't compare it to Resident Evil. Well, at least I can't compare it to anything. But man, they sure knew how to make a PSP game. When I said I heard earlier that past the first game, they weren't very good, I was mainly talking about this entry. A lot of people have some very strong opinions about this game, and those opinions are not positive. I'm gonna say it. Stand back, everyone. I'm about to get controversial. I like this game. I legitimately had a good time and enjoyed my playthrough. Just extremely surprised by the game all around. It's a strange one though. I could have an entire hour-long talk with a couple people about it where we non-stop trash about the game, and then when the conversation is over I hit them with the,
"Yeah man, I enjoyed the game."
I feel like part of the hate comes from it being literally anything but Parasite Eve. It's not even called Parasite Eve, it's called The Third Birthday. Pretty much every element is completely different from the other games. So when viewed in the scope of the series, it's a butthole Parasite Eve game. But viewed as an individual game, it's very flawed, but it still has a lot of fun and unique elements that shouldn't be dismissed. The main element in that the gameplay is challenging and engaging, but so unique. I'm gonna admit I played the game using an emulator. I played them all using an emulator. So controlling it on a traditional controller on a large monitor at 1080p might have made it a slightly more digestible experience than it originally was on the PSP. But man, that gameplay. The essential hook to the gameplay is this mechanic called overdive. It's a mechanic based in the narrative which I'll get to that in a minute. I can't believe I'm going to have to talk about that. The overdive mechanic essentially allows Aya to dive into the consciousness of other people and control them. Aya can also dive into the enemies, which are called the Twisted, and deal a nice chunk of damage to them and stagger them. Aya has 4 weapon slots. She can place whatever gun in her customizable and unlockable arsenal that she wants, and a 3rd slot is for a pistol. She can choose which pistol, but they aren't super customizable. And the 4th slot is for whatever weapon the soldier she overdives into has. Due to the challenge of the game, Aya has to constantly dive between soldiers, as soldiers act as a way to get more ammo to use whatever specific weapons they have, and they even act as a health bar of sorts. They allow for risky play because she can easily dive into another soldier, but too risky of playing and she won't have any more soldiers to dive into, which can be a nasty situation. So the game is spent diving in between soldiers in battle, trying to get better positions on the enemies and dodging their attacks. Even just controlling Aya as well, she's the most mobile she has ever been, with a pretty decent running speed and a fun dodge roll. She does feel great to control and dodge the tons of enemies you have to face. The overdive mechanic really is super fun and unique. The shooting is mostly auto-locking and strafing due to the one-stick nature of the PSP. It really could have been just that, but overdrive turns a potential stale and static gameplay loop into a fast-paced and dynamic gameplay loop about fast choices, dodging, and keeping your soldiers alive. There are all sorts of other mechanics that factor into decision making, like the crossfire mechanic, where if you stay locked onto an enemy for a few seconds, and once the link is charged, all your soldiers will fire at that enemy at once. The more soldiers you keep alive, the more powerful this ability is. There's another mode that Aya can enter called Liberation Mode, where she's essentially juiced out of her tree, and her superpowers are unleashed, allowing her to move super fast and shoot these powerful energy bullets from her guns. It's an absurd set of different mechanics of risk and reward and decision making within a one-stick PSP game. Just the fact that it's a PSP game alone is amazing enough. It's honestly the best PSP game I've ever played, which I haven't played many, but let's admit that. Some of the ones I have played though are Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops, Splinter Cell Essential, and Tenchu Time of the Assassins. I played Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker on the Xbox 360, so that doesn't really count. All these games though take the essentials of their main console entries and strip them down to their most basics in order to fit the games on the PSP. The games then become these empty versions of their console counterparts that are shaved into games that will work on the PSP platform. The PSP for them is a limiting factor, and they're extremely constricted by the platform and thus not very good. That's what makes Parasite Eve 3 different as a game designed for a specific system. It could have stuck with the traditional Parasite Eve style and made a garbage version for the PSP everyone would have collectively hated. Instead, they made whole new systems that fit the platform they were on without having to make as many sacrifices. The main sacrifice it does have come with a simpler, more linear level design and blocky geometry, but even still they managed to excel to an absurd degree for both a PSP game and a Parasite Eve game. I'm championing the game a bit too much right now though. I'm white knighting it a little bit. Let's not get its ego too high up. Let's knock it down a little bit. Straight up, it's one of the most confusing narratives I've ever seen in any game, anime, movie, whatever. Maybe that's partially up to me for never reading any of these supplementary text documents in the game with news stories and all kinds of stuff like that, but I had no clue what was happening in the game. There are some new enemies called the Twisted, and they're doing something I don't really remember. There's these towers that come out of the ground for some reason. All the sequences in the game are told out of order, so I recall it being extremely difficult to follow the game. They were using tons of specific words to the universe in vague terms without really explaining them. Stuff about possible existences and all that. I'm totally cool with these types of subjects and plot elements, but it doesn't explore it in a way that allows it to make any sense, or for someone to even bother wanting to learn what they mean. The non-linear structure of the narrative takes this complex set of ideas and wraps them around each other, cutting sections out of one area and putting them in another, creating this mess that can't be easily deciphered. All these added characters as well feel useless and absurd. Nothing is clear and nothing makes sense. Tetsuya Nomura had things to do with this game, if that helps shed a light on the levels of stupid it can get. There are a few returning characters, but they speak in all the absurd and vacant grand terms about possible existences and everything too. It feels like it's designed specifically to make you confused as a way to fake complexity. There may be some complexity there, and if it is, it's just poorly written. There are tons of sequences spliced in to make you think one thing's going on, so that they can get you later with a
haha, I tricked you, that was insane, right? Hey, please, that was cool, right? Hey, that was really cool, wasn't it, right?
Just thinking about the narrative is getting me a little heated. I don't even care that they completely abandoned pretty much everything about the other games. It's just the contrived Nomura complexity that gets me a little grumpy. And I really don't like using this word, but it is convoluted. I really hate using that word because it is overused so heavily, especially with larger RPGs like Final Fantasy VII, Xenogears, and even the BioShock games. and I often don't think the use of this word is warranted. It's like saying something is pretentious. It's the word that's quick to the trigger when something is a little more complex than your average gamer's single-player narrative that they only play for a couple hours and then claim they like it. Sometimes things are just complex and require a little more thought. This game, though, certainly deserves the word convoluted and all its negative connotations. It feels purely like contrived complexity. But as long as you can enter the game and accept forgetting about the narrative of the other games before you face this game, I think you'll have a surprisingly good time. The game still sits slightly within its horror genre roots as well, so it's often dark and chaotic and bloody. It's never scary, but the whole very apocalyptic scenario as well as some of the very violent scenes, they likely wouldn't be that violent if the roots of the game wasn't in horror. The soundtrack is also dark and fantastic. The songs are much louder and more suited to the fast-paced combat, but some of them are so good. Really just some absolute jams on here. Even if you hate the game, you cannot say the soundtrack is bad. So now that I've reviewed each game individually, it's time to talk about if the series is worth playing as a whole. So anything I say in this section doesn't speak to a single game in particular, but the whole experience. With this comes a few caveats. If you want to play the series because it's a JRPG and that's it, you'll want to look elsewhere. If you are really looking for a horror series and are running low on horror series, it's worth a shot. And as much as I like the series, which I do think it is a good series, it's very difficult to really recommend to people. I can easily recommend each game individually, but it's difficult to recommend it as a series. It's especially difficult to recommend to people who either aren't particularly open-minded about game genres or just aren't as hardcore into video games. Some gamers have particular things they like, and for many people maybe only one of these games will scratch their itch. Some people aren't as accepting of games changing their designs too much, and I think that's where a lot of the outcry came from with the series sequels. Parasite Eve 2 is not the same game as Parasite Eve 1, and Parasite Eve 3 is even further from either of those two. And when there's only 3 games, how do you really say what is and isn't a Parasite Eve game? If you get too attached to one of them and make that the identity of the series, you're probably not going to have a good time. And I can't blame people for doing that either. I would have loved to see the games evolve within the style of the first entry, but they didn't, and it's an unfortunate loss. But there's still an identity within the series that carries on throughout it. And the only people I absolutely recommend it to are the more open-minded and hardcore gamers who are trying to play entire notable series. There's no reason for someone who plays games every once in a while to play the series. All that being said, I still have to iterate to make sure it's understood. I do like the series. I think a lot of people would, and I think a lot of people would be surprised at how much they like it. All the words I'm saying that make it sound like I'm gatekeeping it from more casual players, I'm not trying to do that. It just has enough flaws and inconsistencies in the series itself where it's really difficult to recommend it as a series, even if it is a good series. So I'm still going to recommend it, and if you're interested based on what I've said, please do check it out. It's a series worth playing and worth being remembered, even if it is a problem child. Otherwise, if only one of the games sound interesting to you, I completely understand, and I'd say it's worth just checking that one game out because I do think they are good. Have a great day, everybody. Take care of yourself.